Listen carefully because this update is not about politics. It's about your money, your monthly costs, and what could realistically change in the months ahead. Over the past few days, a lot of people have been asking the same question. Is there a new stimulus check coming? And why are headlines suddenly talking about Venezuela, oil, and Americans benefiting financially? Here's why this matters to you. Anytime the government brings in new revenue, it creates expectations. People start wondering whether that money will lower prices, reduce taxes, or turn into direct payments. So let's slow this down and walk through exactly what happened and what it could actually mean for your wallet. The conversation started after Donald Trump made a public statement saying the United States would receive between 30 and 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil. According to the statement, that oil would be sold at market prices, and the money from those sales would be controlled by the U.S. government and used to benefit Americans. Now, the reason this caught so much attention isn't just the oil itself. Oil agreements happen all the time. What made this different was the wording about Americans benefiting financially. That single phrase is what shifted the conversation from energy policy to household budgets. Because when people hear benefit Americans, the first thought is money. Lower gas prices, lower costs at the store, or for many, the possibility of stimulus-style payments. So before assumptions get ahead of reality, we need to break this down clearly. When new money enters the system, it only ever shows up in everyday life in three possible ways. There are no secret fourth options. The first is price relief. That means costs slowly come down. The second is tax relief. That means you keep more of your own money over time. And the third is direct payments like stimulus checks or rebates. Every headline, rumor, or political talking point eventually funnels into one of those three paths. The real question isn't whether the money exists. It's how it gets used and how long it takes. Let's start with the option people usually feel first: price relief. Oil affects almost everything you pay for: gas at the pump, grocery deliveries, utility costs, shipping, and transportation. When fuel prices rise, budgets feel tighter almost immediately. When fuel prices ease, even slightly, households feel it over time. If millions of barrels of oil enter the U.S. system, that increases supply. Increased supply can reduce pressure on prices, not overnight and not dramatically, but gradually. A few dollars saved on each fill-up may not sound life-changing, but over weeks and months it adds up. For many households, that kind of relief feels just as real as a check because it's money that never leaves your pocket in the first place. And here's the key point: price relief doesn't require Congress. Markets react based on supply, demand, and expectations. That's why price relief is usually the fastest and most realistic outcome when oil supply changes. But price relief isn't guaranteed. It depends on global markets, transportation timelines, and how quickly oil actually enters circulation. So, while it's possible, it's not something you see immediately after an announcement. The second option is tax relief. Instead of sending out checks, lawmakers sometimes choose to adjust tax policy. That could mean lower withholdings, expanded deductions, or credits that reduce what you owe when you file. Tax relief feels quieter than a stimulus check. There's no envelope in the mail, no direct deposit notification. But over time, it can be just as meaningful. More take-home pay, less pressure during tax season, fewer surprises. The downside is timing. Tax changes require legislation. They take time to debate, pass, and implement. That means tax relief, if it happens at all, usually shows up months later, not immediately, which brings us to the option everyone is watching most closely: direct payments. Stimulus checks get attention because they're simple and immediate. When they arrive, people feel the impact right away. That's why every time new government revenue appears, the conversation turns to checks. So let's be very clear about where things stand right now. There are no stimulus checks approved under this oil plan. There are no payments scheduled. And there is no automatic process that turns oil revenue into direct deposits. That doesn't mean checks are impossible. It means nothing has been authorized yet. Stimulus payments only happen when Congress passes a law that clearly defines who qualifies, how much they receive, and when payments go out. Until that happens, checks remain an idea, not a program. This is where timing becomes critical. Even in the fastest political environments, government processes move slower than headlines suggest. Oil has to be transported. It has to be sold at market prices. Revenue has to be collected and officially recorded. That alone can take weeks or even months, depending on logistics and market conditions. If lawmakers then decide to pursue tax relief or direct payments, an entirely new clock starts. Legislation must be written, debated, passed through both chambers, and funded. Even when there's urgency, that process usually stretches over several months. So, realistically, even if stimulus payments were pursued, you would not be looking at something immediate. You would be looking at later in the year or beyond, depending on how Congress moves. This is also why stimulus checks keep coming up in conversations even when they don't materialize. Over the past year, several payment ideas have been discussed publicly. There was talk of tariff-funded dividend checks. Those checks were mentioned multiple times but never approved. There was also discussion about returning savings from government efficiency efforts back to taxpayers. That idea gained attention, but it never became a real payment program. There was one payment that did happen, but it was narrow and specific. A limited group received a one-time dividend funded through existing accounts. It was real, but it was not a broad stimulus. All of this creates confusion. Ideas get mentioned. Some payments happen in specific cases, but broad stimulus checks require very specific decisions, and most proposals never reach that final step. So the real issue here isn't oil, it's expectations. When people are dealing with high prices, tight budgets, and uncertainty, any mention of new government money sparks hope. That's understandable. But there's an important difference between revenue entering the system and that revenue reaching individual households. Some people believe the best use of new money is direct payments. Others believe lower prices and reduced everyday costs help more people over time, even if no check ever arrives. Those outcomes feel very different. A check feels immediate. Lower prices feel slower, but they can quietly improve budgets month after month. So, as this conversation continues, here's the question that actually matters. If new money comes in, should it be used to send checks directly to households, or should it be used to reduce everyday costs and pressure over time? Because both approaches affect your finances differently, and which one matters more often depends on what your budget looks like right now. That's why it's important to stay focused on what's confirmed, what's still developing, and what's realistically possible. Not every announcement turns into a payment, but every policy decision eventually shows up somewhere in your monthly expenses. And that's where this story really lives.